Hi, I'm Andreea Muresanu. I'm a product owner at Blockex. To put it very simply, a blockchain is a decentralized database. It's a distributed ledger that records transactions and stores data about assets on private or public networks of millions of computers around the world. These transactions are cryptographically locked together in blocks of data, creating an immutable, tamper-proof recording of transactions. It doesn't require an intermediary or central agent to authenticate or settle a transaction. Trust is intrinsic to a blockchain and is established through cryptography and the work of individuals called miners. I'll elaborate on that a little bit more later. This allows for decentralized verification of a transaction that has been added to the ledger. Miners follow a protocol to authenticate transactions and agree on the validity of a transaction. The way it works is that miners dedicate computing resources to authenticating transactions, together making up a massive amount of computing power. Through this work, miners find new cryptocurrency they can keep, and also get paid a fee per transaction to perform this service. Once a transaction is authenticated, it gets time-stamped and linked to a previous block of data. That block is linked to a previous block of data, and so on, creating a chain of blocks of data, hence blockchain. The distributed maintenance of this database, along with cryptography, ensures the security of the data against manipulation, because you're able to see what changes occurred, when they occurred, and who made the change. The data in these blocks cannot be altered, so data stored on a blockchain makes auditing very simple. To summarize, the characteristics of a blockchain are: it's immutable, so any change to data on a blockchain becomes immediately apparent to all participants. You can append and amend, however, every move is recorded. Hacking is technically unfeasible unless you've hacked and obtained all the private keys held by all the users that have ever used transactions on this blockchain, which is highly improbable and is much more safe than a traditional database, which has one single point of failure. Whereas that's not the case with a decentralized storage of data. Blockchains are verifiable, so the validity of a transaction can be confirmed automatically without the involvement of a third party. The only trust point is a user's private key. Data is distributed among multiple systems and is verified by miners. And once a consensus is reached by the miners, a transaction is validated. Blockchains are based on cryptography, so the authentication and authorization of participants is done through cryptographic keys, almost like having a physical key to a safe. So data security is achieved through keeping keys safe, which is much easier to do than ensuring against a database being hacked into because you can store keys offline. The most well-known application of blockchain is the digital currency Bitcoin, where transactions are tracked and the transfer of funds are made without an intermediary like a bank. Bitcoin acts as electronic cash. Once funds exchange hands, the transaction is final. You can't spend that money twice. In 2009, an individual or group of individuals called Satoshi Nakamoto created the Bitcoin protocol. The story in people's minds used to be that Bitcoin was something to be used for illicit means. But that's what people said about the internet as well. And actually, anything can be used for illicit means. Cash is widely used for illicit activity. Anyways, I think people have moved on since then and now see the value of Bitcoin. It's a great store of value. The scarcity of the currency is guaranteed as only a certain number of Bitcoin exist. Only 21 million Bitcoins will ever exist. There is no need for an individual to have a bank account in order to use Bitcoin. A huge percentage of the world's population is unbanked. Our current financial system isn't working for those people. Bitcoin gives those people access to a global economy. Another important feature is that it's impossible to impose currency controls on Bitcoin, protecting people from things like the limits on cash withdrawals imposed upon Greek citizens a few years ago. Banks didn't have enough reserves to support a bank run, and as an individual depositing your money into a bank account, you may think that money belongs to you, and so you can do with it what you want when you want. But as the Greek experience shows, that's not quite the case. Bitcoin is a store of value like gold. It won't be lent out the way your bank deposits are. It's yours to be accessed whenever you please. Furthermore, Bitcoin is censorship resistant. So governments can order the freezing of a bank account or Visa card, which is of course what happened to WikiLeaks' Julian Assange. This financial blockade was circumvented because WikiLeaks was able to accept donations in Bitcoin. Money was not intended to be a way to track people's identity or to restrict payment for political reasons and censor people. Bitcoin prevents governments from using currency as a political tool, and I think that's important. Blockchains have some other very interesting use cases. They vary widely, and I see the potential for blockchain to positively impact many aspects of society. Blockchains can enable the digital ownership and transfer of assets. While the ownership of assets like land registry is widely recorded on paper, which presents several problems. For example, most land titles in Haiti were held in one central location. The earthquake in 2010 destroyed that building, and along with it almost an entire country's title deeds and land registry records. Instead of paper, we could have digital storage of asset ownership and the ability to digitally transfer that ownership as well. The transfer of ownership of an asset is usually a lengthy process that involves paper documentation and many interactions between individuals, making the process quite time-intensive and costly as well. Whereas turning to a blockchain solution could drastically reduce the amount of time required to transfer an asset, and would also reduce the legal fees and other costs associated with doing so. Identities are confirmed through multiple sources, increasing transparency and reducing corruption as well. I lived in Sweden for a year, and they're quite organized and technologically advanced in their provision of social services. And what they're doing now is testing the use of blockchain for land registry. So normally it takes months and months to complete a real estate transaction in Sweden, but they're putting all of those transactions on a blockchain, significantly reducing this time as well as errors and the potential for fraud. Another interesting application is the way blockchain can be used for data storage and sharing. In the future, you could store all your personal data on a blockchain and then reveal only the data needed to execute a transaction, which would protect your privacy and prevent companies from monetizing your data as they do now. This would also ensure the database in which your data is stored is tamper-proof and would only show the right people or right companies what you need to show them, and also for a defined period of time. The use of blockchain in the provision of social services could be incredibly impactful, particularly in managing health records. So I have a friend who's dealing with a health issue at the moment, and she told me that she has had scans sent between hospitals, sometimes by fax, lost 3 times by 2 different hospitals. She doesn't have access to her own medical scans. She has to rely on her health system to safely store and move her scans. It's stressful enough to be dealing with a health issue. She shouldn't have to deal with having her health records lost 3 times in the span of a few months. Using blockchain technology to store and move patient data would help with this, and would also result in huge time efficiencies. Doctors and healthcare practitioners are not meant to be data entry clerks. Their time is extremely valuable. They should be spending their energy with patients, not being burdened by data management. Hospitals and pharmacies wouldn't have to send data and physical documents back and forth to each other. They could simply all look at the same blockchain ledger, which would be automatically updated with the latest patient information. It would also be secure and tamper-proof and would reduce the prevalence of error and the high cost of paper-intensive systems. Government agencies collect and store data about citizens, often without the ability to share that data with other government agencies, and some even in paper format, requiring people to travel somewhere to make any changes in person. Many times I found myself dealing with government agencies and filling out paper forms, filling out the same information on a similar paper form with a different government agency a month later or a year later. And I've often found myself surprised while doing this and thinking, there must be a better way. I mean, it all just seems so antiquated. Interacting with citizens could really be improved. Digitizing records and putting them on a blockchain could enable them to be effectively managed and shared with other agencies, and would also protect data from unauthorized access. For example, Estonia stores its citizens' health data using a blockchain and is planning to do the same with other government agencies, which is quite impressive. Blockchains can be used to facilitate supply chain transparency. So blockchains can be used to trace the provenance of products or materials within those products, which can be so difficult because of how many entities and materials interact with a product before it gets to a consumer. This can be particularly impactful in combating things like counterfeit drugs, where customers can have full transparency on the supply chain of their pharmaceuticals. Blockchains can be used in money transfers, like sending remittances. So expats who send money back home normally spend what they make in several hours' work just to send that money. Whereas with Bitcoin, it would cost pennies and money could be sent in a fraction of the time. Blockchain can enable regulatory transparency so that compliance checks can be fully automated, with transparency over decision-making and also over the individual who executed a particular transaction. Blockchains can be used in intellectual property issues. So, like in the music industry, blockchains can be used to fairly compensate the creators of value, like artists and composers, by connecting them directly with consumers of their art, creating a peer-to-peer marketplace without the need for a record label intermediary to take a cut. Artists can use smart contracts, which automatically implement the terms of an agreement once certain predefined conditions are met, and can trigger a payment to the artist immediately upon consumption of their art. I think large organizations could really benefit from blockchain. Before I moved to the UK, I worked at the United Nations office in Geneva. And often when I tell people that, their first reaction is to say, oh, the UN is so wasteful, it's so bureaucratic, etc. Now, I can't comment on the validity of that statement based on my personal experience because I worked at a research institute on social and economic development, so we didn't have to deal directly with those kinds of claims. But what if foreign aid was distributed directly to beneficiaries with smart contracts? That would reduce the bureaucracy and also drastically increase transparency. And in the future, voting could be done using a blockchain. I mean, the possibilities are endless. As individuals within a society, we constantly need to interact with one another and constantly look for ways to trust each other, to be able to exchange value with one another. So far, we've relied upon centralized intermediary institutions to enable us to do that. For example, we've relied upon banks for the storage and transfer of currency. At a time when trust in these institutions has eroded so significantly due to economic events such as the 2007-2008 financial crisis, I think technologies like blockchain that allow individuals to bypass these institutions and transact peer-to-peer are a breath of fresh air for people. Our financial system is fairly antiquated and makes use of technology, some of which was built in the 70s. Millions of people around the world are not being served by the financial system, and blockchain has the potential to really revolutionize our economy. In addition to the erosion of trust in our institutions, as an economy, we're also dealing with unprecedented levels of income inequality. When thinking about the example I gave earlier about the music industry, blockchain and peer-to-peer marketplaces can democratize the creation of wealth. People will no longer need intermediaries to profit off their work. People can be compensated directly by the consumer, which when adopted widely, will start to have a positive impact on the income inequality that is so prevalent and has clearly been detrimental to individuals and our economies. I've heard thought leaders in this space liken blockchain's revolutionary potential to that of the internet. And I personally can't wait to see what positive, disruptive transformations lie ahead for us by making use of this incredible technology.